everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly. And today I have a really special guest who comes from me across this little digital divide. He is a big-time brainiac. He has written more books, received more fellowships, and sits on more academic chairs than I have time to talk about. He has made really a life's work of deep diving into South Asian history, colonialism, contemporary culture, and cinema, and has done really tremendous work about Mohandas Gandhi. His scholarship is not restricted to the fortunate few at UCLA, where he is a professor, but is also available through his YouTube channel. Most importantly, for the purposes of this show, we're here to talk about someone we both knew and admired, James Lawson. He passed away just last week at the age of 95, and I will say this to begin. If there was a Mount Rushmore for social justice, in my view, James Lawson would surely be on it. He mentored and led what I consider to be, at least in America, the greatest generation of nonviolent activists that include Martin Luther King, John Lewis, James Bevel, Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, and others. He was at the point of the spear that really invented a decade, that being the 1960s. And so I am so happy to have him here, Vinay Lal, to talk about it. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause. How are you?
Thank you, Bill. I'm fine, and pleasure to be with you.
I think this is an appropriate moment on Juneteenth of all days to talk about someone we both knew, James Lawson. And I had forgotten a little bit, but there was this tremendously detailed and really excellent article about you in the LA Times the other day about your extended relationship with James Lawson. Just as a point of departure, I kind of want you to talk about that a little bit.
So our first meeting was in 1998. I have a very warm recollection of what he had said, because he had spoken about the importance of Gandhi for him and the importance of Gandhi's teachings for the world. Well, then we met maybe another 10, 15 years later. This was at a church in Pasadena, and we spoke in our own different ways about what is the meaning of nonviolence. And I proposed to him that we do a little book of conversations. And he said, well, I'm intrigued by the idea, but I need to know a little bit more about what you really have in mind, what sort of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So I took him out to lunch at a restaurant in Westwood, an Italian restaurant. And we conversed for an hour and a half, and he said, I'm persuaded. I think you could do a decent job with this book. And so the first of our meetings was at the Holman Church, a church where he was now already the emeritus pastor at this point. He'd been the pastor there for 3 decades, something like that. The church was, in a manner of speaking, his church, not only because he'd been the pastor for so long, but there's one of the buildings is named after him long before he passed away, of course, a few days ago. We met there, and it was, I think, just a week after the passing of Nelson Mandela. We started our conversation with our views about Nelson Mandela. That, Nelson Mandela is often put in that trajectory, or line, if I may put it this way, which runs from Gandhi to Martin Luther King. And for those who are well versed in the history of the movement, not just King, but the other great stalwarts of the movement, because everyone in the civil rights movement was acquainted with the teachings of Gandhi. And not just acquainted in a casual sense, but they had studied Gandhi. John Lewis had studied him. Bernard Lafayette had done, Diane Nash. They had all studied Gandhi. And we know that Gandhi's texts were among other works that were used by Reverend Lawson in the basement of his church in Nashville when he first did these nonviolent training workshops, right? And what was a point that Reverend Lawson and I agreed upon, which is that in South Africa, the pursuit of nonviolence didn't take place in as rigorous a fashion as it did, either in India or in the United States. When I'd initially broached the idea, I had suggested to him 4 meetings. So I have about 27 hours of conversation with him. And during the course of this, we discussed the civil rights movement. He never, by the way, liked to call it the American Civil Rights Movement. Sometimes he called it the Rosa Parks King movement. There were other expressions that were used as well. But we talked about that. We talked about Gandhi. We talked about the idea of nonviolence. We talked about Black America, the condition of Black people. We talked about incarceration. We talked about American empire because, he had an intellectual appetite for a large number of things beyond the movement. I think most people knew him in the capacity of an active campaigner for social justice. We know that after the assassination of Martin King, that when he eventually relocated to Los Angeles, then he became involved in social movements over here. Some people know about his work with people in the working class. Beyond all of that, Lawson had not simply an intellectual curiosity, he had an intellectual stake. That's very important. Intellectual, moral, and political stake in thinking about the United States and its place in the world. To impress upon you what I mean here, let me recall what Martin Luther King had said during the course of the war in one of his most famous speeches, when he said that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. These are almost exactly his words. Now, Lawson really did think that was a case, not just back in the 60s, but has been the case with the United States, for decades, down to the present day. And I think, again, that part of his critique of the US and all of that, I don't think that has really been taken very seriously. He also coined this phrase, really, in a way, it's his phrase, plantation capitalism, as he called it. The totality of our conversations was about a great many things, but you can see the links between all the subjects that we spoke about.
I was in the workshops and I wrote a screenplay about him, and he really defied some of our stereotypes of the Southern preacher, the stem winder, Martin Luther King waxing poetic. Yeah. To me, the image that I have as I wrote about him and as I got to know him was he was like a physics professor. He was a scientist. I mean, he was deeply imbued with these ideas in his soul. But when he shows up in Nashville, he has like this perfect laboratory to put these ideas to the test. And I think it was a spectacular success. Could they use these tools, follow this sort of disciplined playbook that had been laid out by Gandhi, and see if it works? By the way, maybe it wouldn't. Could, in a country drenched in violence, nonviolence prevail? And it did. And so that's sort of the image that I have for him. And then when I sat in the Holman workshops, which were generally, I guess they were always the last Saturday of the month, I was so impressed by his vitality. He was already in his late 80s, maybe early 90s. He could stand up. I have some video of it and really just talk for hours. And the thing that he said to me, or to all of us, was that nonviolence, or the Satyagraha, or this, is a discipline that is no less rigorous than if you were a Navy SEAL. That it takes preparation and work, and it's not just sticking daisies in gun barrels. It's researching, making demands, finding a creative space in whatever the exact situation. So, for example, in Nashville, Black people can purchase stuff downtown, but don't sit at the lunch counters.
Yeah.
That might be a key to unlock bigger issues or larger issues of segregation in the whole thing. That was what was so fascinating and so dramatically interesting to me, as someone who writes screenplays. Just being in his presence, I felt like I was in the presence of somebody really great, like great. This is, we read about being in the presence of these giants or spiritually invested people. And I have to say, I felt that around him. And I'm just a guy from the Valley.
You're absolutely right. You felt yourself in the midst of someone who, to use a very common word, exuded a kind of a greatness. There was an aura around him. Some people would say charisma. Charisma is a very complicated word. For the moment, I don't really want to use the word charisma because all kinds of people have charisma, and that's not always for the better.
Exactly.
Sometimes it can be for the worse, right? So, for example, Adolf Hitler may have had charisma,
Must have.
and so I think we have to be aware of using words which, as I said, have a very complicated kind of a history. There's no question that there was a kind of an aura around him, and he had this. Lawson had this wonderful laugh. So he'd say something and then he'd laugh. He also had a kind of an appreciation of, irony. I would say a great sense of humor about him. So it was, in that sense, a person who was quite unusual because the person of firm conviction, but this firm conviction also came with enormous amount of compassion, a sense of irony, intellectual curiosity, a capacity to absorb ideas and to think aloud, and to frankly engage anyone in a conversation. Now, why is that important before we move on to some other things that you had been hinting at? It's important because the person who's perpetrating violence is implicitly saying, I am in possession of the entire truth. Okay? I know best. And the violence is justified by the fact that I know better than you do, whatever it is that is in dispute. Okay. Now, the reason you have to have a conversation is you always have to entertain not just the possibility, but the certainty that in virtually all situations, you can never be entirely in possession of the entire truth. The opposing side, it may be an iota of what they say may have a glimmer of truth in it, but there's something there always, because otherwise, what's the basis of trying to dialogue with someone who seems irrevocably opposed to you? And I think that when you look at the present conflict here, when you in Gaza, and when you look at the positions that people have adopted, you see precisely one problem there is the fact that people really don't converse across the divide. I mean, there's some people who attempt to do that, but in general, people don't because they just simply assume that their position is the only position really to adopt. This is again where someone like Gandhi comes in, because Gandhi came from a cultural, religious, and intellectual milieu in which Jain philosophy was very important. So Jainism, as you know, is a religion that goes back to around the same time as Buddhism. The worldview that came out of Jainism, there are a couple of principles which were critically important. One of them was the idea of ahimsa, that is, nonviolence. But the one that I really want to speak to here in connection with what we're speaking about is the idea of what the Jains called anek anantavad, which is the many perspectiveness of reality. So there's a parable. In fact, actually, the parable is recorded as having taken place during the time of the Buddha as well. These six blind men are asked to describe an elephant. Well, they're blind, so they've never seen an elephant. So one touches the tusk of the elephant, right? And says, "Oh, the elephant is like a spear." And one touches the tail and says the elephant is like a rope. The parable argues that each is partially right and each is partially wrong. And you need all of these perspectives together to think about an elephant, right? Now, I think this is critically important when we're thinking about the idea of a conversation. Why are conversations critically so important? Why we must persist with them, particularly across what seem to be insurmountable divides.
What this discipline that you're talking about, in my view, takes practice. It's like nobody's born with it. I think Lawson, to a certain degree, was trying to build a discipline for that approach so that rather than going to the mattresses, all of the Godfather, maybe we can go to the coffee house and have a cup of tea and see where we actually might find some common ground. Like, that actually takes practice. The discipline of nonviolence, you got to practice it, just like the piano,
One of the things you had said in your earlier set of remarks was that Lawson really went about the practice of nonviolence as though it were a science. Okay, it's important to speak to that aspect of his thinking. You use the word practice. I'll use another word as well, which is process. Okay, it's a process. Let's think of it this way. So let's first think of the most common objection to nonviolence. Okay, Lawson and I spoke about this for quite some time. The most common objection is taking, let's say, the illustration of the British in India, because, of course, that was the terrain where Gandhi worked, right? India was under British rule. And the objection, very simply, has been this, that Gandhi was fortunate in that his opponents were civilized.
Right. British law.
That he was lucky that his opponent was not Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, right? Or some other kind of totalitarian despot. Because the objection is that had his opponent been the Nazis, for example, or Stalin, or people of like mentality, he would have been crushed. Nonviolence wouldn't have had remotely a chance. Now, Lawson and I talked about that, and both of us would sort of laugh because we'd heard this so often. And I can remember hearing this from my childhood, really. Mm-hmm. All right. And in India as well. I'm not just saying in the United States, but in India, where I spent, my teen years as well. Let me respond to that. One of the few instances of successful resistance of any kind is actually the Rosenstrasse demonstration, okay, which was completely nonviolent. And there have been a couple of books that have been written about that. And I won't get into the details of it, but it essentially involved German women who were married to Jewish men
in Berlin.
And the demonstration took place outside the Gestapo headquarters.
Correct. I'm aware. Yeah.
Across the street in recent years where it took place. And scholars will tell you this was one of the few movements of resistance that really was successful and was a nonviolent demonstration. But the most critical point is this. Now, if you're going to have a nonviolent movement, you can't expect that it's going to begin in 1942 and then you expect real results. Okay, you have to think about how long it took in South Africa, how long it took particularly in India. It was built up over a period of time. It's a process. That's what's important to understand. That brings me then to the related question of what you call practice and what Lawson describes as nonviolence as a kind of a science. What Gandhi did, what his real achievement was, to bring the idea and vocabulary of nonviolence into a common conversation for the first time in history. Okay? That he introduced a new vocabulary, a new grammar of nonviolence. Now, what does it mean to think of it as a science? Okay? And what does it mean to think of it as a process? So, a nonviolent movement has to go through certain kinds of steps. Because nonviolence is not simply the absence of violence. Let us be very clear about that.
Right.
Not taking up arms is not nonviolence. So, if for him, in a manner of speaking, India was never that perfect terrain where you could actually carry out the idea of nonviolent resistance. That's one reason why the possibility of a nonviolent struggle in the United States interested him. How do we know that it interested him? We know that from many circumstances, most of all from the fact that in 1936, when he was in his ashram in Sevagram, he is visited by Howard Thurman and his wife. Howard Thurman, a great unsung hero of the 20th century. There's some theologians who know his work, but he was prolific. He wrote beautifully. This conversation they had is recorded both in his autobiography and in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. Right? And what was that conversation? The end of that conversation was Gandhi says to Thurman in unequivocally clear terms that it is very likely that the next great phase in the history of nonviolent struggle will be the struggle of your people for social and racial justice and equality. He didn't use the phrase racial justice because that's not a phrase that was used at that time. Of course, I'm just paraphrasing. Gandhi said in 1936. So there are several considerations here. One is that in some ways you can think about the achievement of nonviolence in America as something that was greater, frankly, than what happened even in India. There are some reasons for that, which I've been hinting at. One of them, of course, is that in India, the culture is extremely different. You also have an Arms Act. Ownership of arms was severely restricted. United States is a completely different proposition. I mean, here it's the worship of the gun. It's the worship of the gun, which has been going on for decades, for centuries, so to speak. Well, for 150 years at least. I mean, the whole genre of the Western is partially based on that. But even the South was awash with guns. And I don't know if you know this episode, the story about when Bayard Rustin was first called to King's residence, and this is the Montgomery bus boycott before it was launched. They decided that they would invite Rustin because Rustin had already been involved in nonviolent protests. In fact, he had done a freedom ride years before the freedom riders.
The core, well, the original one in 47.
Exactly, right? So Rustin is called in to advise. And remember, Rustin's not from the South. He's from the North, actually.
He's a Quaker.
And he's a Quaker. Right? So he's from New York. He comes down, and when he came to Martin King's home and he sat down on a sofa, he felt something in his butt, something pinching him there.
Yeah.
And so he removes this cushion, and there's a couple of guns there. And says to Martin, what on earth are you doing with these guns? And you want me to train you or tutor you in ideas of nonviolence and talk about my experience? You got to get rid of these guns, Martin. And Martin King says to him, Bayard, you don't know what the South's like. Everyone's got to carry a gun here. And then Rustin told him, well, no, you've got to get rid of these guns if you're going to begin to think about nonviolence, right? Interesting story, but this is simply by way of suggesting that, as I said, that the circumstances and the American South and the United States generally were very different than what they were in India. Now, from Lawson's standpoint, you see, if you think of nonviolence as a kind of a science, so what does it mean? You can override all of these cultural, sociological contingencies, okay? Because his view was, when you have a movement, nonviolent movement, there are certain steps that you take. You proceed in a systematic fashion. So, for example, the first step is you say, we're going to actually inquire into what happened. We're going to collect all the facts. Right. Collect all the information. A lot of people who jump into this Gaza conflict with views, all right, and will start writing, fervently about this or that, about what's going to work, what's not going to work. Frankly, many of them don't even know the full circumstances on the ground. When I say full, of course, I mean, you can't know the full, but that is that you conduct an inquiry to the extent that is possible. Let's take an illustration. Again, go back to Gandhi, because that's what Lawson would do. Every time he wanted to illustrate the point, he'd go back to Gandhi because he had studied all of Gandhi's campaigns systematically, right? So at Champaran, before Gandhi becomes a world historical figure on the international stage, he comes back to India from South Africa in 1915, January 1915. In 1917, he leads what is really a local movement. Okay, it's going to be 1919 before he's going to be catapulted onto the national stage, because Gandhi also, in a sense, knew that he had to find constituencies. What happened in Champaran? Champaran, the word that I used a minute ago, this is a district in North India, in what is now the state of Bihar. So there were these indigo planters and peasants who used to work on these indigo plantations. Right? And working conditions were extremely hard. Right. So what does Gandhi do? He goes to that because he's invited by one of these indigo farmers who has heard of Gandhi and has heard of the work that he had done in South Africa, thinks that this man might be able to help us out. So Gandhi agrees to go to Champaran. But what does he do? For an entire month, he collects testimonies. He doesn't make demands. He doesn't immediately say, oh, we demand this from the administration. So before you make, quote, a demand, let's ascertain exactly what's happening. And Gandhi sits down patiently day after day, records hundreds of these testimonies, listens to what these indigo farmers have to say. Then he assesses them, right? And then he speaks to people on the opposite side. Right? There are all these steps that you have to take. And it's only after you've done all of that that you get to the next phase of the struggle. So, similarly, when you think about what Lawson was doing in Nashville, so let's go to Lawson in Nashville. But the Nashville campaign, which Martin King would later on say was the most systematic, the first systematic campaign, really, and nonviolent resistance in this country in that sense, following the Montgomery bus boycott. At his workshops, Lawson, what did he do? So it's not only that they read Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi and Tolstoy and the Sermon on the Mount, they read these texts. If you read John Lewis's autobiography, he gives you a list of
Against the Wind or With the Wind, the Wind.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. The people who attended this workshop were not only John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and Diane Nash and James Bevel, but there were many others.
Marion Barry, among others.
Marion Barry, yeah, who subsequently became the mayor of.
And white kids, too.
White kids. So I was about to get to that, and there were white kids, but they were predominantly also students from the neighboring black colleges and universities, right? Historically black colleges and universities, and that. Lawson had not only studied Gandhi, but he had read, obviously, and he had not only read. This was part of his inheritance. He had, as a preacher, as a pastor, as a Methodist minister, he read the Bible, of course, and knew exactly what Jesus had said, that you have to be able to bear the suffering of others upon yourself. And you have to be able to, so to speak, take retaliation. Okay? So what was the training? He said, look, if we're going to desegregate these lunch counters, you should expect that you're going to have racists who are going to come and beat you up. They're going to throw ketchup in your face, and they're going to throw mustard, right? And they're going to humiliate you, mock you, laugh at you, and beat you. And you have to be able to take all of this. And he would actually enact this out. That's what was enacted out week after week. He's training you to be able to withstand that humiliation, okay, and think of it in a different way, transform that humiliation into something else.
You know, when I wrote those scenes, some of which were at the Highlander Folk School and other places, the thing that hit me as they literally would do, as I understood it, improvisations. You know, they would play act these things. And it reminded me so much of my acting classes in New York, you know, and all I could see was in my mind's eye was Lawson sitting there like Jack Garfine, who was a brilliant director and my acting teacher at the time. Sitting there watching these improvs take place, it seemed to me like an acting class in a way, because they're using imaginary circumstances to create another reality to practice for, of course, the real thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
It's like, this is acting class. And sometimes people would get carried away. It could get carried away with the racist, the person who playing, the race baiter could get carried away, or the person who was abused, they had to really struggle to constrain themselves, and maybe they would react. And actually, that's what it was for, because you wanted to get that out of your system. You wanted to be corrected. You wanted Lawson, or whoever that moderator was, Lawson, really, to say, no, we're going to dial that back. You're going to breathe, and we're going to practice this moment so we can get it for the real thing.
Yes.
And when I read those accounts, I said, oh my God, I can write this, because
right. Yes.
It's acting class.
It resonated with you. Yes. That was part of the training that, the students who came to this workshop received. As I said, it wasn't only reading the text, but it was this. And I think that they learned over the years. So the strategy of filling the jails, for example, so there's quite a lot of discussion in the civil rights literature about this particular strategy of filling the jails. And again, something that, happened in India. I don't know that, for example, one difference is I don't know that Gandhi ever really, theorized it as such, but he was clearly aware of the fact that when certain actions were taken, there would be certain consequences, and repression would follow. And part of that repression was to hold thousands of people, as happened after the Salt March and the Salt Satyagraha, because the Salt March was part of that, what becomes a larger Salt Satyagraha. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were hauled into jails, and eventually many of them had to be released. And as you know, what happened here in the U.S. was that people would be actually arrested, and then they would be taken to a place 50 miles away and just dropped there.
In terms of Lawson's trajectory, for people that aren't as familiar, he did go to jail as a conscientious objector or some sort of a refusenikt as a result of the Korean War. He also was amongst the very first on the first bus to Parchman, or rather to would be Jackson, from Montgomery to Jackson. He was amongst the first kids in, and he wasn't a kid, he was about 10 years older, I think, at Parchman. There's a great picture of him in the back of the bus with the National Guard guy. I mean, he was the mentor, this kind of Lone Ranger figure as I imagined him. But he was also at the point of the spear. And I asked him once, I said, I read all these books and there's very little that describes your experience in Parchman. And he looked at me and said, yes, that's been very overlooked in all the literature. But yes, I was indeed there on the bus and amongst the first to go to Parchman.
Yeah. One of the great books on the movement, which does do Lawson quite a lot of justice. I mean, it has pages on him and on his role in mentoring people like John Lewis, is David Halberstam's
The Children. Now, I might add, I have the rights to that book. That's how
you do.
I secured the cinema rights and to that book. And that was my point of departure in this journey was Halberstam's book, The Children. And Lawson told me, because we discussed it, he said, that's the best book, at least about, this corner. Halberstam is sort of the master of the profile. He doesn't really put together the scenes for you, if you're trying to connect a narrative that could be a movie. But as you said, his description of those meetings in the basement and the Parchman experience, of course, Halberstam was in Nashville. He was a young reporter there. And in earlier drafts of my screenplay, he was a character because he's sort of the witness from the Nashville Tennessean who's like, writing about this. One of the first times the white press, as you kind of inferred about this, is actually on this stuff. The black press had been on it for generations, but the white press had kind of like, I don't know, LA Times also, California Eagles doing these stories about Central Avenue and abuse. But the LA Times is like, well, what do we know about that? So anyway, all this stuff is central to my own journey. And I went to these workshops because of Lawson's at Holman, because I couldn't imagine. Well, first of all, when I discovered, wait a minute, this guy's right here. He's 5 minutes away or 10 minutes away from where I live in Hollywood Hills. I said, I can't write this and not go to these same workshops that he gave in the basement in Nashville. I feel very privileged as an overprivileged white guy, honestly, to have had those experiences with him. I really feel grateful for him for that. This is so enlightening.
Yeah. Halberstam tells us that there were some people there in this closely knit group of friends and colleagues and activists who, took the view that, look, Martin King didn't seem too eager to want to go to jail, that many of the others would say, hey, you have to be prepared to go to jail.
Big scene in the freedom rides in Montgomery. Golfers.
You want to be able to, and Lawson says that then he had to come in between and say that, look, I mean, you must let him have the measure of things in his own way. We shouldn't judge Martin for whether we think he's willing to take this burden of the cross of going to jail, as it were. So Halberstam has I think a very nuanced kind of description of what happened, and there I have to be really on Lawson's side again, because I've heard this. Even of course we know that one of King's most famous documents writings is the letter from Birmingham jail. But
No.
I'm saying in general, the supposition of many in the movement was that, that he seemed to want to avoid jail. And so therefore, in a sense, he wasn't really tested in the way in which many of the others were. And I think Lawson's view there was, I would say, a more judicious view, that he urged his friends and colleagues and fellow activists that, don't be too judgmental about it. Think about what he's doing, what his role in the movement is. And he knows the measure of things himself.
I will say once that first, that it's not like everybody who heard his speeches about Lawson talk about nonviolence immediately embraced it. Bevel, as I understood it, and as I read and I got into it and I thought about it and later imagined it, he was very skeptical about what are you talking about? Nonviolence. Are you crazy? Medgar Evers, you keep a shotgun by the door, okay? You're nice, you keep a shotgun by the door. It actually took some persuasiveness. It wasn't just like they got the Sermon from the Mount and accepted it. There was some hesitation about this. After all, our story in America, all of our so-called social justice victories were seemingly won at the point of a spear or a rifle, whether it was Bunker Hill or Iwo Jima or the sands of Normandy. All of our so-called liberties were seemingly purchased at the point of a gun. At least that's the narrative. And Lawson and people like Zinn, they start to offer, well, wait a minute. There's like a different story here. Maybe we're missing. I'm sure Lawson talked to you about the Revolutionary War and sort of some of the nonviolence that really precipitated that as well. It was very important when he spoke about it. I remember hearing that. Another thing about, is that what Halberstam described quite well was the differences within the African American community, the generational differences, the ideas about what the hell is Diane Nash doing in charge here? This is for the guy like Foreman. Who is that? They want to talk to me, we want to talk to Diane. Some of the sexist attitudes, and then just the class issues within the Black community, like the kids that were going to Fisk were, the talented 10th. The kids that were at ABT, American Baptist Theological Seminary, basically maybe studied to be small town preachers. And so I thought that Halberstam really painted a very nuanced picture of that world.
Well, one of the things that I had asked Lawson about, I put it to him this way. I said that, look, in the United States, there were disproportionately large number of churchmen who were involved, especially in positions of leadership. Martin King being an obvious example, Lawson himself, a person that very few people except the specialists really even talk about, Reverend Charles Shuttleworth, who was a majestic figure, okay? Literally dozens of others. I mean, think about it. Now, that was not...
C.T. Vivian.
Yeah. Of course, many, many others, right? James Farmer, for example, right?
Yeah.
Rustin is a kind of almost an exception in a way, if you ask me, that he's among those who's not really coming from a background as a minister or preacher or pastor. And I said that was really not the case in South Africa. And of course, I understood some of the reasons why that was not the case in South Africa. In South Africa, in the anti-apartheid struggle, I'm not saying this is the most important, but as someone who studied the Indian diaspora for a long time, there was a significant number of Indians, for example, in the movement too. If I think about the Indians, none of them are Christian, of course. But even among the Black leaders, very few really came from a church background as such. Okay. So I said, how would you think about it? In the U.S., in the American South, it was very different. And he said, well, there are lots of things we'd have to think about. But he said that, one place where Black people could meet without being infiltrated was, he said, the church. This is the kind of thing that Halberstam doesn't really pick up on, if I may put it this way, that he could have spent more time reflecting on this, ruminating about it, because then, of course, you also get into questions of class and gender that you don't really hear about the women. I mean, you hear about Rosa Parks, okay, and that moment. And of course, Rosa Parks didn't come out of the blue. She was a trained social activist.
Folk School, or I think she was at Highlander.
Yeah, but she was also a member of the NAACP and all of that.
She was prepared and trained.
Yeah. I mean, but that was not how the story of Rosa Parks was told or is told generally. I think that's now changed. It was just like an ordinary woman who just took a
Sort of,
seat.
yeah, immaculately conceived kind of a moment, Yeah.
Right. But even today, I think that, when you think about the question of gender and the civil rights movement, I mean, the name that comes to mind is Rosa Parks. Very few people are aware of Fannie Lou Baker or Polly Murray, for example. Polly Murray is such a fascinating figure, if you ask me. And again, she's quite active already in the late 50s. So the questions of these churchmen, and then what was the role of women in the movement? Was there sexism? I think that Lawson and I spoke about it, and he said there was no question that there was some degree of sexism within the movement as well. Of course, Diane Nash comes to mind, but he told me, and Halberstam mentions that very clearly, that there was a lot of competition for her.
They were all in love with her. And she wasn't even Southern, she was from Chicago. One of the more interesting sort of things in that whole thing is Diane's troubled and difficult relationship with me, yes, who's by far the most charismatic and conflicted, and ultimately, although well beyond the boundaries of my story, tragic figures. But he is in himself a very charismatic genius of the moment.
Absolutely. And he had extraordinarily complicated and troubled life long after the end of the. And if you,
yes,
sure you know that.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. And it's quite, it's not worth mentioning, but it's tragic. But he was a character. He's, he loved women, and, he was out there, and that's my movie star, if you're writing, and, I know you love cinema. So he's the guy that chose the scenery for me when I got into that story. And I just, one anecdote that I loved that Halberstam described with Lawson was he was a great athlete. And actually, he was a physical education instructor from what I read when he went to India. Yeah, and there's this description of him playing football at Vanderbilt. He's there as a divinity student. I can just, I saw him. Like you said, he had tremendous stamina. You could see that he was an athlete. And this image of him I wrote it and I had to cut it because you can't do everything. But just, him playing football on the lawn at Nashville and just pulverizing these white frat boys. He's nonviolent, but, he can block and tackle and deliver some punishment within the boundaries of sport. I love that about him. And I did have a conversation with him once because we were talking about collective things and this tension between individuals and the collective. We live with that in our own society. And I said there was no more vivid example of that than like the problem Kobe Bryant was having with the Lakers, because he was a star, yet he can't succeed without living within the collective of the team. And I do recall Lawson just really, it was one of the one times I felt like he really opened up to me in a way that maybe he hadn't before, because I guess he read the sports pages and was thinking about those things too. So he was a full person. I certainly didn't know the full dimension of who he was. He had a big family, and I just sad to see him go. What can I say? We're lucky for
him. Well, I'll tell you one anecdote which is not related in Halberstam, because he didn't really talk to Lawson that much about his years in India. Mm-hmm. And this is related to Lawson's athletic abilities. So as you rightly pointed out, he went to India. In fact, he's the only American civil rights leader to have lived in India. Many of them visited India. King himself went in 1959. Bayard Rustin went on a number of occasions. But Lawson lived in India, in the city of Nagpur in central India, not that far from Gandhi's last main ashram, Sevagram. And he was there from 1953 to 56. He went there as a Methodist minister, but he went there to coach track and field and basketball at Hislop College. Okay, respected college, Hislop College. What Lawson told me was we had a discussion about his years in India, and he told me that, so, they were one evening the boys there in the college were playing cricket. Lawson had never played cricket. Of course, he knew baseball. In India, they had no knowledge of baseball, none whatsoever. So Lawson said, "Let me take a stab at this. Let me try my hand at cricket." So he walks up to the crease, as it's called, and The first ball is pitched to him, and he whacks it for a six. So that's a maximum you can get. A six is when the ball doesn't even touch the ground when you hit it and goes way over the field.
Yeah.
It's like a home run, and in baseball. And he says that they all looked at him absolutely astounded because they said, "You sure, Reverend, you've never played cricket before?" I said, never played cricket before, never touched a bat really. And so, lo and behold, he was in a way almost starting to coach him in cricket too.
He was also, right up to the last few years of his life, an extremely handsome person.
Yes.
Very handsome, movie star handsome. He just, it was all part of it.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you to help shed the light on this person. I don't think the full meaning of his life is anywhere nearly been appreciated in the larger American story, but it's important. I don't think a lot of what we take for granted happens without him. He's kind of a quiet Lone Ranger, an avatar for these ideas. And
it was always a pleasure and, of course, a privilege to be with him. And, he left a lasting impression on everyone.
And, he'd slipped under the radar of American celebrity, which can happen.
Perhaps for the better. He never strove for a celebrity.
No.
He did what he had to do. He worked away quietly, lived a very modest life. And I think it's extremely unfortunate that he's not better known. But, if he had been better known, there was always a risk that you then become part of that celebrity culture that has other consequences.
Right.
And I think people like him don't worry too much about whether they're going to be known to others. And I don't worry about it, frankly, either, because he lived a very good life, and he lived a life which will be etched in the memory of those who know him and will be etched in the memory of humankind.
Yeah, and he didn't suffer for lack of recognition. It was not a point. Although will say, just to repeat, he said, "Yeah, nobody ever wrote about it that I went to Parchment too." He was like, "I was there," But he did not suffer, in my view, because he was beloved in his time and in his community, within his family. Yeah. One of the things about nonviolence is it doesn't necessarily protect you from violence, but he managed to get through 95 years without all that. So, Vinay, great seeing you. But to everybody, if you're interested, you can reach out to me and read my script, Satyagraha in America, A True Love Story. Vinay, thanks for your scholarship, your input, and your friendship. Folks, till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namasaloha. Dig it, daddy-o.
Thank you, Bill.